everyone. This is going to be the inaugural episode of a series that I began last year called Economics on Instagram. So hopefully my seniors from last year are getting positive flashbacks, but I understand if it might be some triggering flashbacks there as well. But hopefully this becomes a helpful tool for the class of 2022 as they embark on their journey to pass the AP Microeconomics exam. So we can see some lovely posters that were made for me by some wonderful students at Saturday School. We can see respectively at the top, perfectly competitive output markets, and the other market extreme of the monopoly, an imperfectly competitive output market, and then input markets at the bottom, the extreme of perfectly competitive input markets, and then the Monopsony model. And that's a lot of econ content, so naturally this is going to be a lengthy video. Hopefully I can get through it quite fast. But the objective of this video is to try to show you the ways in which the concepts and models that we built earlier in the course kind of mirror or rely on some of the same economic principles and foundations as models that we're building later in the course. So output markets, just so I can define that at the get-go, relates to producing things or services, goods and services. Those are what we mean by output markets. Input markets are markets related to purchasing capital or labor or factors of production that will eventually be used to produce output, if that makes sense. Hopefully it does. And so I wanted to also point out that we can see here two market extremes, perfectly competitive output markets to the monopoly model, and perfectly competitive input markets to the monopsony model. And I said in economics we study extremes so we can understand the range of possibility that sort of exists between extremes. And what do I mean by this? I mean that perfectly competitive and output and input markets never actually exist in reality. And monopolies and monopsonies are quite rare. They do exist in reality, more so, but the ideas that these models contain can help us understand the range of possibility that exists between these extremes. Okay? So let's start off with perfectly competitive output markets. We said that if we assume perfect competition, we are going to maximize social surplus. It's called the first welfare theorem of economics. And social surplus, remember, is just consumer plus producer surplus. And I showed you those models in Unit 2 where if we intervened in a perfectly competitive output market, we would actually reduce consumer and producer surplus because we would get weight loss. We might reallocate, we might create a situation where consumers get more social surplus than they would otherwise, or producers get more social surplus than they would otherwise. But we definitely reduce total social surplus. In perfect competition, in perfectly competitive output markets, we're assuming that firms are price takers, meaning they have no influence on the price, they just take whatever price is set by the market. And the way that I've depicted this here is that I have a market for coffee on the left, and then the cost curves and the marginal revenue curves of an individual firm on the right. Before we get into that, I want to talk about sort of the conditions that give rise to perfect competition. The unrealistic conditions, I should say, that give rise to perfect competition to create a situation where firms are price takers, have no influence on the price. So it would be stuff like firms selling identical products. They have perfect information about prices. There's quite a bit of firms, zero transaction costs, and zero barriers to entry. So there's no barriers for a firm to actually start producing whatever is being produced. And so the example I gave you that is pretty close to perfectly competitive output markets would be your teachers in the parking lot all setting up lemonade stands with identical lemonade using identical formulas. And so we can see that the price that is set in the market becomes the price that the firm has to operate with. They can't raise the price, they can't lower the price, right? And so what happens here, we said, this price also becomes the marginal revenue curve for the firm. So the additional revenue associated with additional units of output. And that makes sense because you have to charge the same price for every unit of output you produce. You can't price discriminate, so marginal revenue should be a straight line, a horizontal line with a slope of 0. This is also the individual firms, or the demand curve for that individual firm's output, which is perfectly elastic. That firm raised the price even a penny, then all the lemonade buyers would go to another lemonade stand. In this case, all the coffee buyers. Then we have a marginal cost curve that intersects the ATC curve at its minimum, and then crosses the marginal revenue curve. Then we can see that this firm is making profits. We said in the short run that might be possible, but in the long run, because there are zero barriers to entry, the supply curve for the market would shift to the right, and then we would get a price that is tangential to the firm's minimum point of the ATC curve, right? And we expect firms to make zero economic profits in the long run, called normal profits. Right, so it's a helpful model because there's some application to this, to thinking about markets that are obviously not perfectly competitive because they don't exist in reality. But we'll get into that a little bit later. I want to go to the monopoly model now. So with monopoly, there is one seller of a good or service that has there's one producer. And monopolies have special powers. So this is the other marketing stream. We watched a video on Luxottica glasses, and I have my Luxottica manufactured glasses here, my Ray-Bans, and that 60 Minutes report. And although it's not quite a monopolist, it's pretty close. Monopolists, we say, are price makers, meaning they have influences on price. And as we can see in this model here, the demand curve, because Luxottica still has to respect the demand curve, or any monopolist has to respect the demand curve, and they own the whole market, so the demand curve should be downward sloping. And we said that marginal revenue rises at a faster, or falls at a faster rate than the demand curve because of what is called the poisoning effect. Meaning that a monopolist, if they can only charge one price, has to lower their price if they want to sell more output on all of their products. And so this creates a poisoning effect, so marginal revenue should fall at a faster rate than the demand curve. It's a little bit hard to understand, so go look at other videos in the description if you need help. Then we have an ATC curve, or marginal cost curve that rises and intersects the ATC curve at the minimum point, and then the intersection of the marginal revenue and marginal cost curve is going to be the profit maximizing condition. From this intersection down, we should get labeled here, which is not labeled in this one, Q star, and then from that intersection up, that's the actual price that the monopolist can charge. And so this distance between this intersection here and the price is what is called a markup, which this lovely young lady labeled in blue. And this markup is essentially this idea that a monopolist has a special power to charge a price greater than the cost to produce a good. Then this blue markup area and this red area too becomes producer surplus. So this person made a little bit of a mistake. We do get deadweight loss, right? Even though we don't have government intervention. And so this is what is called a market failure, where leaving the market to do its own thing doesn't produce the social welfare maximizing output. If this were a perfectly competitive market, we would get a price at PC, so a price that would be lower than the price that we're getting, and we would have more output, but since it's not, we have lower output than perfect competition and a price that is higher. Our consumer surplus is all this red over here. What this means too is that government intervention would actually raise social surplus. Could, I should say. And I'll show you how to do that later on in the course. So that's perfectly competitive output markets. Or I'm sorry, that's the imperfectly competitive output market of monopoly. Now let's go to the perfectly competitive input markets. And so hopefully you see sort of like the parallels between perfectly competitive output markets and perfectly competitive input markets. Sort of the same economics, but with a little bit of a twist because they're input markets. Let me take off my glasses. So perfectly competitive input markets are interesting. So we can see right here, suppliers in perfectly competitive input markets are workers, and demanders are businesses when we're talking about labor markets. So here we have the market for baristas, so people that are actually going to make the coffee that we talked about in the earlier example. And then we have the individual cost curves and marginal revenue curves associated with an individual firm. And we can see in this example, just like in perfectly competitive output markets where firms are price takers, This time we say that firms are wage takers, meaning they take the wage that is given. They have no influence on the wage. And we can derive the wage, right, from the market, and it becomes, we see the wage is a horizontal line. This becomes the wage that the firm has to offer baristas. This also becomes the marginal factor cost curve associated with hiring additional units of labor, which makes sense because you have to give each additional unit of labor the same wage, and so it's a constant, so it should be a line with zero slope. And it also becomes the supply curve for labor for that individual firm. So if that firm were to charge or try to offer a wage that was lower than this, everybody would just go to another coffee shop. And then the demand curve, which we said is a function of marginal revenue times marginal product of labor. So we call that the marginal revenue product of labor, which is also, we're assuming perfectly competitive output markets, and we said that if we assume perfectly competitive output markets, marginal revenue is just the price of the good that is sold. So marginal product times the price, which is just a fancy way of saying that the way that we value workers is a function of both their productivity and the actual price of the good or service that they are making. So I gave you the example of, people that are making, workers probably more valuable that is making computer chips as opposed to potato chips. Okay? And assumptions of the model: perfectly competitive output and input markets, perfect information about wages, no transaction costs. So meaning there's no frictions in the labor market. You would be able to go to another coffee shop with ease if they offered a higher wage. Finally, at the other market extreme is the monopsony model. And so here we can see this would be a market extreme where there's only one buyer of labor. And so we saw that video about Alan Kruger, may he rest in peace, and he talked about sort of the ways in which he had like this wonderful research about the minimum wage, and he showed empirically, he observed a natural experiment taking place between New Jersey and Pennsylvania, where New Jersey waged the minimum wage, and under the perfectly competitive input markets, we would assume that employment would be depressed, meaning there'd be a reduction in employment. And he saw that there was actually no reduction in employment. So we can use monopsony to help us think about why there wouldn't be any reduction in employment, and we'll talk about that in another video. But the monopsony model, we can see that the demand curve is downward sloping. The supply curve is upward sloping, but the marginal factor cost curve rises at a faster rate than the supply curve. It's essentially the reverse of the monopoly model. In that video of Alan Kruger, remember he talked about how monopsony is essentially the reverse of the monopsony model. And we can see that here. And the reason why the marginal cost rises at a faster rate than the supply curve is sort of like a poisoning effect as well, where if you wanted to acquire more and more workers, you would have to raise the wage, right? That's what this upward sloping supply curve means. But you couldn't just raise the wage on the next marginal worker because everyone else would get offended. You would have to raise everybody's wage, and that means your marginal factor cost rises at a faster rate than the supply curve. Then we use the same profit maximizing rule, this intersection of marginal costs and marginal revenue. Remember, demand curve is marginal revenue product of labor. Go down to the x-axis, that's Q star. That's your profit maximizing quantity, that's what you'd probably employ. However, at this intersection, you can actually judge the worth of workers, right? WU, which we put here, but the wage that you offer is going to be W star. And that gap between the worth of the worker and the wage that you offer is kind of similar to a markup in some sense, right? As a firm, you're able to offer them a lower wage than what they're actually worth. That's the characteristic of monopsony, unfortunately. And we talked about how IDEA has some monopsonistic tendencies. There are other monopsonistic type tendencies. We watched the video about airplane pilots. We watched a video about firefighters, how they get paid a wage less than what they are actually worth. And we said kind of a signal that we're operating in a labor market that is monopsonistic is labor shortages, which we can see here at this wage. The monopsonist demands more workers than is actually supplied. However, So this gap becomes the shortage because people are not as willing to work for that wage. And we can see consumer surplus right here. Consumers in this case are businesses, so we'd expect it to be quite large. Deadweight loss, so this is a market failure as well, and that means government intervention could potentially increase social surplus and then producer surplus. WC right here would reflect the competitive wage, and QC would reflect the quantity of labor actually employed if it were a perfectly competitive input market. I hope this video was helpful. It's a long video, 15 minutes, but all of this economics is essentially so much of what you need to know for Unit 2, 3, 4, and 5. In a 15-minute video, I think I did a good job.